and this is the age of monsters. And I think to some extent we are indeed in the age of monsters. So the purpose of our conversation here is threefold. First of all, over the past, I would say, decade in particular, and so a little more, there has been sometimes an over-focus on development finance in a manner that has been somehow disconnected from real economy transformation. We somehow got financialized in our own development finance discourse. And I think it's important to recognize that as much as it's important to explore new tax regimes, new debt regimes, new regimes for international development cooperation, these are all somehow financial flows. But the question is, you can have new tax regimes, but what are you taxing? You can have a different debt architecture, but what are the reasons for an over-propensity to borrow? And all of these reasons lie at the heart of the structure of the national and regional economies. So there has been, to some extent, a disconnect between the development finance conversation on tax, debt, international development cooperation, and the real economy transformation. So that's certainly one objective, was to try and relocate issues of tax, debt, and more into the trade and finance and general reshaping, reinvention of the global economy. But then this conversation doesn't happen in a particular, casual moment in time. It happens in a moment in which we are literally in a phase of dramatic reshaping of the world order and the global economy. We are in the middle of trade wars, and not even only trade. You can say that we are into a war economy. And in some cases, that war economy is already playing out as an open conflict. In other situations, it's a pre-belligerent economy. So where do we then locate our discussions and our aspirations in this particular geopolitical context? Not only because we aim to reconnect development finance with structural economic transformation issues, but because we need to locate them in the particular reconfiguration of global power and in the way in which the global economy is being reshaped in these particular circumstances. And that, I think, leaves a number of questions, which are not only general questions, but are particular questions for the African region, And the last consideration is, of course, is that many of us have been engaged quite intensely, and certainly as civil society financing for development mechanism, many of you being part of, into the road towards the conference in Sevilla, which have been in many ways a very challenging process, and certainly one we are not happy with in terms of outcomes. But when we think about what is next, again, in this attempt to reconnect finance and structural transformation and locating it in the current geopolitical war, we also need to ask ourselves whether the instrument of engagement, the instrument that we have been using to struggle, are the ones that are going to be helpful in this particular moment. So that's a little bit the context of the session. And as I was saying, we have more open questions than answers. I'm joined here by three distinguished colleagues, which can simply introduce themselves as they speak, but you probably already know them fairly well, so they do not require introduction. And they will share with us a few initial reflections, and hopefully we'll then engage with those as we move forward in the discussion. So let me start with my brother here. Tete, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Tete Homeku. I work with the Third World Network, Africa in Accra. I just like to take the few minutes that I can speak to just provoke, right? I want to just make a provocation that especially directed at my African brothers and sisters and our allies. It's the allies I want to formulate it, okay? Our allies in the global north, okay? And my statement is simple. I think that to pick up on something that Stefano has just said, we run the risk of fighting today's battles with yesterday's weapons. And in the process, run even the bigger risk of being marginalized when today's battles are settled in the future. In other words, if you are fighting today's wars with yesterday's weapon, when today's wars are set in the future, even more further apart. This is what I think Africa is now. And I'll try and describe the character of the battle that has been fought and what we are fighting with and what we should be doing. And I'd like to pick it up from what I think was the outcomes of the FfD process in Sevilla, where we can be going from it. Because in the FfD meeting in Seville, we all went, wherever we are coming from, whether we are for debt and things like that, with a number of aspirational demands. We wanted the FfD process in Seville to reorganize the global system along some aspirational demands that will create a better space of African countries to do X, Y, Z, right? Isn't it? Whether it's on debt or finance of ODA. And almost all these things can be summarized along a number of things. One, a space that recognizes and affirms the sovereignty of African countries and developing countries in the South to assert their choices and policy space to develop as they want. And essentially, so when we say there's debt, there's so much debt that is undermining our fiscal space. When we say there's trade, ODA is undermining our policy space. When we say ODA, we want ODA to be given to us, but we still have the choice to do all those things. So it's a choice about sovereignty. Excuse me. And if I was being a cynical man, I'll say, but why is the West resisting this kind of thing? I'll give them the policy space. Give it to them and see what they do with it. Because really, policy space, sovereignty, right to do things are aspirational things. The question is, what do you do with it? In what context? But the thing is that even as we are making those demands for policy space, the global economic order within which those things make sense, we're being reshaped. There's a fight going on now where the global political economic division of labor, within which the idea of policy space to develop makes sense, is being torn apart and re-put together. So if the thing is being torn apart and being put together again, and you are asking, I want a space to develop in that space. By the time you get that space, the thing has been put together differently. So I say, okay, give me another space, right? And I'll use just a quick example about just one of the outcome areas in the FfD space to illustrate this thing. And I'm choosing that one because it also represents the future. The future, because in fact, and I'll come about the Africans, the whole question about critical minerals and the future. Everybody, critical minerals, we are shouting, is the future. So our demand is African countries must be allowed to be able to process their own critical minerals so they can develop out of it, etc., etc., etc. We can be part of regional value chains. We don't want to export our minerals raw anymore. And we're all very excited, right? And I want you to take a look at the outcome document. You can summarize in 4 paragraphs. It says, yes, we shall give technical capacity to African countries to process their minerals and get into value chains. We shall support them to develop their regional capacity, etc., etc., etc. And in fact, we shall support them to adopt the regulatory reforms that allow them to attract foreign investment to help them develop. Each of those things that we got in the FfD space is about what we shall do in our own country. There was total silence about what changes will take place in the global economy to facilitate those things. Total silence. You can go and look at it. Nothing. But why? That's the thing. And in fact, I nearly got in an argument with another of my African colleagues who said, okay, we got to Geneva with Severe, we didn't get anything, we should go home and concentrate on ourselves, which is okay, that's what you got, right? But in fact, as we are talking, the issue of critical minerals is being reshaped. The global international economy about how critical minerals be mined, how to be processed, what the price range is being shaped already. It's being shaped, right? How is it being done? On the one hand, critical mineral is not about minerals. What is critical about a mineral is not the critical. It's about how it inserts into industrial strategy of who. So for the European Union, they don't talk about critical minerals. They talk about critical raw materials. Because for them, whether it's lithium or rhodium or whatever exotic name it is how are you going to use it so that they can continue to power their industries of the future, right? China, actually, in defining critical minerals, includes also minerals which are not that critical because they are still talking about industrial transformation. And in fact, as I was saying, if you think about it in Africa, probably clay is more critical than lithium. No, seriously. Clay is the most environmentally friendly building material in the world. You build with it in all the pre-colonial architecture. Clay buildings, you don't need air conditioning. It warms itself up, it cools itself up, and it's not as polluting as cement. So in fact, if you are thinking of critical minerals, clay will be critical mineral for us if you are talking about the future. But forget, what I'm trying to say is that each country defines critical minerals as an industrial strategy. And not only that, it is precisely because of that critical minerals are an area of contestation, right? When Donald Trump says, I'm going to take over Greenland, and I'm going to make peace in Ukraine, and I'm going to do this thing, he's talking about critical minerals that he thinks he needs. And when Donald Trump says, I should be given Nobel Peace Prize because I made a peace in Congo DR, it's because, they gave him critical minerals to make a peace, right? So the US is precisely talking about critical minerals. Why? And they'll come to see that very soon. But in the same place that Donald Trump is making peace between Rwanda and Tshisekedi because he claimed critical minerals, so also there is China. And China has stolen the march on everybody else. China actually has got financial institutions for South Africa, BYD, who is defeating Tesla. BYD has got shares in financial institutions in South Africa to allow it to invest in lithium in Congo DR so that BYD can vertically integrate lithium to its batteries in China. And Chinese companies have bought so much shares in lithium mining companies in Australia, the Australian company will come one day and say, no more merger and acquisition. But why is this happening? I mean, when Trump is trying to acquire critical minerals in Ukraine and Greenland, it's not because there's no lithium anything in America, no. It's because, just like China, everybody wants to hold on to what they have, monopolize what they have in their space, and get access to somebody's space, because that's where the competition is hot enough. China manufactures, has about 70% of the rare earth minerals in China. It processes about 60%, processes about 70%, and refines about 90%. So critical minerals is part of an industrial struggle, but the reason why it is hot now is not simply because all of them want to have the critical minerals. What's happening is that there's a big shift taking place in the international economy. You see, we are talking about critical minerals as part of industrialization, right? But the global capitalist economy of industry is undergoing systemic shifts in terms of power, who holds power. Over the past, every time we talk about advanced the industrial economies of the West, because Canada, US, Japan are dominating it. But you see, over the past 10 years, China is no more the global assembly plan for cheap manufactured products. No. China, right, over the past 5 years has got 70 or 40% of all the automotively run industries. Companies in sectors which are run by automatings. China is the lead. China produces more solar energy than anybody else. In fact, 40% of the electronic batteries used in Europe is produced by China. In other words, if we are thinking about critical minerals as the future industry, right, China has jumped the league. And precisely because China, and if you like add that, Brazil and co are coming, but because they have jumped the gun, that's precisely why the US is jittery. So whatever Trump is doing is not simply Trump. After all, the policies that Trump has now, Biden initiated it, and Obama started already. So what I'm suggesting is that the critical minerals debate that we're having now is connected deeply the systemic shifts in the international power about industrialization. One more thing, then I come to say what it means for Africa. But see, when you hear geopolitical battles, right, you think about China and America as rivals. They don't want to talk to each other. Xi Jinping wants to beat Trump, right? But actually, forget about that optics. The top 5 FDI sources in China are US, UK, Germany. In other words, foreign direct investment in China are still from US, UK, and Germany. SAIC, Shanghai Automotive Industrial Corporation, which is one of the biggest car makers in China, is in joint production ventures with VW. Right? China invests very big in Brazil and co. In other words, below the headlines of states fighting are capital FDI merging together to do things. Now, the European car makers and battery makers started crying about 2 years ago that please, we need support from the European Union because the Chinese battery makers have been able to produce so much, they are setting the global price. The price at which they are making batteries is so low that we can't compete. Basically, what I'm trying to tell you is that below the radar of competing geopolitics is the interaction of foreign capitalist companies which are setting the price about how batteries were made, how critical minerals were manufactured. What it tells is one thing. The structure or the critical resources for the future industry is being set already in the market. If Africa now wants to produce critical minerals and batteries, it will have to compete against the global price system. So that's why I say, look, if I was America, I should stop these Africans say they want policy space. I say, okay, get it. Huh? Now come and produce your batteries into your policy space into our market, which we have set out already. In fact, it reminds me, Kenneth Kaunda, in 1965, nationalized the copper minerals in Zambia to assert sovereignty and nationalism. Then he found out that the whole global economy of copper was controlled by the transnationals from the minerals all the way to, and then therefore he couldn't do anything with it. And that's where we are. You see, unless as Africans we find a way of disrupting this global mechanism, almost all the demands we are making about policy space, sovereignty, equality will be nothing. Unfortunately, this is the language we are talking at the moment. In the WTO, African countries are still saying we need to industrialize, right? And add value to our raw materials, and we need policy space. No. We should ask ourselves, what is our strategy for industrialization? Do we want to use critical raw materials to make EV, electronic vehicle battery? Because that's what we say. Okay, in the olden days, we exported our materials raw. Now we want to add value to it. But add value where? If you listen to almost all the top level policy people in the AU, AMGIF, everything, they are talking about also getting into the electronic vehicle market. But think about it. At most, there will be 60 million rich middle-class Africans who will buy SUVs I'm being jealous. Because even I'm a middle class, but I'm quite a poor man if you look at my shoes. No, but so even if we want to get the electronic vehicle SUV race with our critical minerals, we'll be shut out. We don't have the market for it. And we cannot compete at the price level with BYD. But the reason why we are thinking about SUVs is because we are thinking about industrialization wrongly. When Africans are talking about industrialization from the AU and everything, and please, I'll stop very soon. It's simply that we are thinking, okay, we also do the value chains and get on, right? And in fact, I suspect that part of the convention about industrialization is basically what the European Union do, what East Africa do, how do you have industrial policy, how do you pick winners, how do you select strategic sectors, whether it's energy, and put there. No, really. You see, Africa is the only continent in the 21st century in the whole world that has not carried out two important historical revolutions: agrarian transformation, linked to manufacture. These days when we talk about agriculture, we talk about food security. I mean, I get sad because it's as though all that we know about agriculture is food security. Basically, the rural people should feed the urban. No. Agriculture as an integral economy is a farm economy where the skills of manufacture are linked together. But in Africa, 70% of the economic population which are in agriculture. Now, 470 million of agricultural people are small-scale households, smallholder economies, still, two-thirds of who are women, still using hoes and cutlasses, or things to no technology. Now, if you wanted to talk about industrialization in an African condition, you start by saying, how do we energize and empower the 470 million households so that we can release their wealth that will be your domestic market? If all of them were using hoes and cutlasses, think about that. How can you use your lithium simply to say, I'm going to make handheld plows, right, which are powered by electron battery? Forget about the competition for SUVs. How do I use lithium to transform agricultural productivity? Because once you do that, you are empowering, you are increasing the earning capacity of rural people to buy. And the thing about agricultural technology is that it's not importable. Every time you import, you must modify it. To modify it domestically means you are empowering your capital goods sector. It's linking up immediately. In other words, I'm saying, but you won't hear any African country talking about this. Until we talk about this, we don't have a strategy. If we don't have a strategy, we don't have a principle. And let me make the last one about policy space, okay? Ever since the WTO was established in 1995, and I've been joining and going to the WTO ministerial since 1996, right? Since 1995, no new agreement was adopted in the WTO until 2013 trade facilitation. Every attempt to do an agreement has been resisted. So there's no new agreement on tariffs, anything, right? And if you look at that structure, African countries are free since 1995 to raise any level of tariff they want. Vietnam joined the WTO in 2008 or something like that, or earlier, under more onerous conditions than African countries. But today, Vietnam will wipe our backside out on the ground because they are beating us industrialization. Why? Because they have a strategy. We don't have. So what I'm saying is that, and the final thing, the fight that we are having today in the world is how to reorganize the power base of industrialization. If we keep on fighting about policy space and all those things and be demanding that in WTO and things like that, and don't get our act together about what strategy we are pursuing, by the time Trump's warfare resettles in 5 years' time, everybody will have achieved something on the ground. You see, I'm sorry, I don't want to take my, but you see, what's happening is this. So when Trump imposes a 50% tariff or 20% tariff, or something, what Trump has done is have become so crazy, everybody is shocked. They are regrouping. Every region is regrouping and reorganizing what to do. If you don't regroup in the fight of battle to fight the battle, you're not going to. And Europe is regrouping. Europe is now talking about procurement for military, military economy, and it's sure in that process it will be trying to make sure that American companies don't get access to the procurement. Vietnam is also doing their thing. Everybody is doing their thing. We are the only people who are not regrouping yet. If we don't regroup, the time is like when you go to war. The armies will fight until they are exhausted. When they are exhausted, they say, okay, we are tired, let's make peace. But the peace will be made on the basis of where your armies are on the field. If your armies are not on the field, the solution will exclude your armies. That's what I'm talking about for now. And I'm sorry, it's his fault. He didn't stop me earlier.
I didn't stop you because it's always fascinating to hear the way, and I think that was a little bit the purpose of the discussion, you know. I don't know if you've ever seen the invisible gorilla. Are you familiar with it? The invisible gorilla is a very famous psychological experiment, you know? And I've actually been using in classes quite a lot of times. You know, it's a very simple situation in which you see two teams that are passing a basketball, you know, and you ask people within the room or within any group that is watching the video to count the passes. Now, in the middle of this, there's somebody dressed up as a gorilla that walks through, stops in the middle, you know, sort of does this and walks out. In any experiment, and they have been repeated thousands of times, 50% of the participants do not see the gorilla. Not only when they are played the video and showed it, they are convinced that it's a trick. You know, this cannot be the video I've seen before because it's impossible that I've missed it. Now that's called selective blindness because you focus on something, the passes, then you sometimes miss major things happening in front of you. And what is interesting is that neuroimaging shows that everyone that is looking at that, the eyes actually are looking at the gorilla. It's not that you won't see it, you just ignore it. And when I think about the invisible gorilla, sometimes thinks about ourselves. You know, we're so busy chasing certain things that you actually miss major things happening precisely under your nose. So thanks for pulling out the gorilla that probably we haven't been seeing. Jane.
I have this
Oh, you
one.
have.
Okay. Thank you so much, Stefano. And thanks to comrades for coming so that we can have this conversation. Thank you, Tete, for setting that tone. It's really difficult to come after Tete. You know, I like the way you put, you know, all these things in perspective. What I'm going to look at really is our options as Africa and how we can be able to engage in other spaces, the UN, the multilateral spaces, the bilateral spaces. How do we engage to make sure that we have, you know, that policy space, that we can be able to transform structurally, transform our economies? How do we do that? But also to have a fiscal space to be able to do that. Tete has already pointed out to the fact that we are living in turbulent times, and Stefano has also pointed that out. There are global shifts, global tensions, and you know, there are the fights between the US, the EU, you know, as they say, when elephants fight, what suffers, it's the grass, and Africa can be looked at as a grass, but also they say even when elephants make love, again, the grass suffers. So we need to locate ourselves within those global global shifts. And how do we locate ourselves in there so that we can be able to fight for a structural transformation? And that's not debatable. This is what we have been discussing all along, that we are commodity dependent, and the implications of being commodity dependent, export dependent, is that we have trade deficits, our ends are not meeting, balance of payment problems, all these cycles of debt, indebtedness are because of that. You know, we can't create decent jobs because we are exporting raw materials. So what we are looking at is how do we then position ourselves in that global terrain, you know, so that we can be able to structurally transform our economies. And I will just add on to what my brother Tete has said. I think it's really important to, first of all, understand where we are. Our economies, we have understood we are exporting raw commodities basically. And the fear is that it's going to continue with the critical materials and critical raw materials, that export of raw materials will continue. But we need also to understand, when we talk about structural transformation, how does it look like, And we bundle these words around. We want to structurally structural transformation, and sometimes we equate it to industrialization. Sometimes the two, we use them synonymously, that we want to industrialize. But does industrialization mean structural transformation or not? And we have seen a number of countries, my country, Uganda included, we have special processing zones, EP zone. What would we call them? The industrial zones. And we have them all over. And when you look at, every year they tell us we have 10 industrial zones and we are industrializing. But you look at these industrial zones, they're almost islands on their own. They bring goods from China, they repackage, put them on the market. But they provide them with incentives, free land, free electricity, cheap labor, and all that. Is that structural transformation or not? So we need to be clear. What structural transformation? How does it look like? And then what does it take to have that kind of structural transformation? So for me, when we talk about structural transformation, we are looking at strengthening the backward and forward linkages, We are looking at, as Tete has said, increasing agricultural production and productivity, because that's where our economy is located. 60%, 70% of small-scale producers are in rural areas, and that's the basis of our economy. And we can't wish it away. In Uganda, we have a debate. Some economists were saying, no, we don't want to hear those small-scale producers. But that's what we have, and we need to cut our coat according to the clause we have. We have small-scale producers, and they won't go anywhere unless we want to exterminate them, So that's where we need to start from. And we need to grow that productivity, but we need to link that productivity to manufacturing and industrialization. And then we link it to trade. Then we link it to modern service sector. Today, when you look at our service sector, and they tell us our service sector has grown, and we celebrate that we have jumped what's that? But when you look at our services sector, it's delinked completely, and it's small people running up and down doing these little things, and they are delinked from trade, they are linked from agriculture. So we need to agree what structure transformation. Then we agree, how do we get that? How do we structurally transform our economies? And we need to be able again to do the linkages between sectors. For example, trade and trade policy should speak to investment policies. They should speak to finance. They should speak to technology. And this is what Tete was saying. You want to structurally transform your economy. But you are looking at EVs, but the people working in agriculture using a hoe, does that make sense? Is that the technology that we need? So what kind of technology can speak to that structural transformation which we need, so that policy should speak to each other. And this is what Stefano was saying in his opening remarks, that there is a link now between finance and the real economy. We don't support the real economy. I was looking at our budget as Uganda. The budget to agro-industrialization, that's agriculture, industry, trade, cooperative, fisheries, it's all lumped together. It's 2.5% of the total budget. 2.5. So that link between finance and agriculture. And when you look at even the loans, we are indebted. When you look at the loans we get, where they go, they are big projects. We need them, but I think we need to balance. Big projects, SGR, those huge railway lines and dams and expressways, but nothing to agriculture, nothing to industry. So we need that. We need to rethink, because the current policies we have, the current policies need a rethink. The whole issue about liberalization, deregulate, do that. We need to rethink a number of our policies, and this is where we can be able to say, like Tete has said, we have a policy space. Take an example of investment. We, in the WTO, there is no investment agreement. Since a long time, people have been saying, no, we don't want an investment agreement. At the WTO, no investment agreement. But when you look at the bilateral treaties we have signed, the national investment policies in place, you can't be able, we are tying our own hands, because of those policies we are putting in place. So again, we need to rethink, what kind of policies do we need to be able to structurally transform our economies. So if we have that in place, we know this is the kind of investment policy we need, this is the kind of trade policy we need for us to be able to structurally transform our economies. Then we can be able to go ahead and negotiate that at bilateral level, at multilateral level, But when you look at the way we do our negotiations today, in bilateral negotiations, we want to add value to our products. We negotiate an agreement like the Economic Partnership Agreement, where we say we are not putting any restrictions on export of raw commodities. And then we stand here and say, we have to industrialize, we have to add value. So we need to look at those contradictions. Maybe I stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jane. Jason. So I think we had one side of the equation in terms of perspective and challenges, I think, on the transformation of the economies, and I think there are certain elements that come out quite forcefully, right? Certainly the fact of looking, I think in the past we referred to it as a commodity-driven industrialization approach. But I think what Tete has been adding is the fact that we've tended to have this distinction between low technological intensity industrialization and higher technological intensity. I think here the issue is how do we bring technology and the use of even of rare minerals, if you want to call them like this, into that commodity industrialization strategy and into that sort of food transformation strategy. The other element that comes in is that we've had a lot of focus on supply policies only, supply side, while maybe the critical dimension is to understand how to look at the virtuous cycle between demand and supply in a manner of therefore expanding the extent of the local economies and regional economies. So those are two important elements, which of course are quite at odds with the kind of negotiations that Jane has been mentioning as well. Now the question is, how does global finance connect with this? And how do our development finance aspirations and demands interplay or don't with all of this? So over to you.
Thank you very much, Stefano, and to Comrade Tete and Jane for the framing remarks on that one half. And I guess it's this part of the conversation that where the monsters become a little bit more apparent, as you very nicely described what this session is actually about. So I think let's start with the point of the delinking or the deviation between, under the premise that finance and development are not in tandem. And I think that dichotomy is where many African governments, we also perhaps even in the civil society space, tend to find ourselves in a very difficult conundrum. The deviation between finance and the real economy, and in the middle there, then, is the debt crisis. Because you have a financial system, a financial architecture that is then deliberately designed to deviate you from the investments that both Tete and Jane are articulating, to this perpetual set of rules where you are deregulating, liberalizing, and creating the externalization of finance from your own domestic resource mobilization capacity and productive capacity. So in that sense, the international system, as we've heard the entire week, is then devoid from or externalized from the continent. And therefore policymakers, civil society activists, academics are still grappling with how do we bring those two things together. Of finance, so foreign direct investment, tax incentives, tax holidays, the industrial zones that Jane was talking about, the high-end industrialization ideas around electric vehicles that Tete was mentioning, that are devoid from the developmental needs and developmental realities that we are actually facing on the continent and in the space. And global finance has very nicely reacted to that by creating itself in a vacuum that can just distract policymakers away from the development needs to actually continuing to perpetuate the externalization of finance from the continent. And so, I mean, I've been discussing over this past week the issue of how comes things in the cost of living in Ghana has actually, I found it quite expensive. I don't know how many people have had a chance to go outside and explore and just shop. The cost of food is extremely expensive, and this is someone coming from Nairobi, where people always complain that Nairobi is expensive. The reason I'm highlighting this is the artificial nature of why things are expensive right now in countries like Kenya and Ghana. There is a manufacturing or manipulation of exchange rates. to help keep local currencies at a particular level, to then continue this idea of external finance coming into the system to service a particular set of interests. At the moment, in many African countries, it's creditors, to make sure that the debt situation is in a particular place, and then completely devoiding or avoiding the developmental sector. So this is where you start seeing the deviation and the diversion of resources away from the real economy, away from those investments in the light commodity manufacturing, towards the high-end value commodity manufacturing, and you see development finance or finance in general focusing on keeping the current hegemony of the financial architecture in place. Two other points I want to make around this is that there has been very little reflection internally, and I think Tete was alluding to this, and yesterday even Dr. Patrick Nzana Olomo from the AUC, highlighted 55 countries are in Japan for the 9th TICAD meeting. And, he's talking about African member states negotiating, to put it very bluntly, negotiating how to import rice, into the continent. It's not just rice, but the point is that's how basic, our negotiating strategy or our negotiating plans have been lowered to or regressed to, because we don't have a strategy, and because we don't have a strategy, we don't have a set of principles. Whereas then the role of finance continues to circulate outside of this idea that development can actually take place, that economic transformation can actually take place. And then we are reduced to this idea of, let's do exchange programs on capacity building, technical assistance, that is the level in which we need to look internally at this conversation and start thinking through, how do we pull ourselves away from that? The last point I want to make is the moment that we find ourselves in, and the monsters that we're having to grapple with. I've been reflecting on this at a personal level, but this is probably one of the most opportune times for us as a continent to be as disruptive as we would like, as we could imagine, without there being any recourse, I think. And I'm enthused by, and I say this because I'm enthused by what the reaction by India's Prime Minister to the recent additional tariffs that were imposed on India, the 50% tariffs. The response was, that's fine, but as long as the deal doesn't look good for us, we will trade or buy things from wherever we want. And I'm just asking myself whether, as Tete was positing, are our leaders thinking that way? Yesterday there was an honorable member from Lesotho who talked about how we let the US administration get away with remarks about no one even knows where Lesotho is, so it doesn't matter if we put tariffs there. Right? We let them get away. We let the administration get away with saying that making that comment. And so I think we need to take a step back and ask ourselves, do we really want to let this moment of monster and monstrosity pass without us doing anything about it, without us maybe, taking hold of those reins? Professor Beckles mentioned, the issue of reparations, the issue of justice, the issue of change is not given, it's taken. And I think in talking about how global finance, global economic governance, how we bring it closer to the real economy, how do we bring it closer to those investments around commodity investment and advancement at a light level to medium to intermediate and then finished, that's where we need to be going. Because the risk is we continue, that chasm continues to widen, the structural challenges continue to persist, and what will happen on the continent is we have a missed opportunity, but a booming a demographic bubble also that will burst. There'll be no dividend, and the risk of so many other spillover effects as a result of that. And so I think, just trying to understand and unpack the moment that we're in right now, and why then this debt crisis perpetuates itself because of this void that exists between the finance and the development, the real economy development, I think is something that we do need to take apart and take opportunity with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. I guess as I open the floor, I think a small addition, I would say the corollarium of also Teta's point of the absence of a clear strategy for transformation in this particular turbulent context, then also means that considering the fragmentation of the governance and policy discussion, where trade happens here, global finance up there, debt here, tax elsewhere. Now, if you do have a clear strategy, you can play it out in different spaces in a coherent manner. But the absence of that strategy means that in every space, something completely delinked and uncorrelated ends to happen. And therefore, rather than converging, you basically are pulled over in all possible different directions. And I think that's pretty much what is happening. Because on the other side, there's a very clear strategy, then and the fragmentation is actually intended, then it plays out in their favor, But in this particular case, it actually tends to be yet another, elements of disruption. So I guess these are some a little bit reflections that try to interrogate what is happening with the missing link between structural transformation, trade, investment, and development finance, and particularly in this age of monsters, requires yet another set of clear considerations. So floor is open for, first of all, for your comments. Of course, if you have questions, but don't assume that there are answers on this side. I think if you ask questions, be ready to answer your own question, first of all. But therefore, thoughts are welcome. I see there's a hand there. Let me hand you the mic.
Thank you very much, comrades. Tete, it has been a while to hear you making these reflections. Comrade Jane, quite important reflections as well, just to appreciate. And so I was reflecting recently. I was reading this paper about how China is using a multi-layered approach to de-risk or to secure the publicly guaranteed loans from Chinese multilateral institutions. But the scheme is such that the net revenues from mineral exports from the emerging markets and developing countries, almost 20 to 30% of the mineral revenues doesn't reach the source countries. And it's a model that Chinese public institutions are using to secure loans that they are giving to our countries when they lend us. But I think the concern is really around how these revenues, the mineral revenues, which are quite critical if we connect with the industrialization that we are talking about, our desire to transform our economies, you then see that if we are not receiving back most of our mineral proceeds, it compromises our fiscal revenues, but it also compromises our capacity to finance our development needs. But on the other hand, our government are pro Chinese investments, and the thinking is that this is a new friend. But I think there is a significant risk considering the extent to which we leverage mineral exports as a key driver at the moment, or key anchor of our fiscal policies. So I'm just throwing for your comments and to relate with the other issues that you have just shared. Thank you.
Now it's on? Yes. All right. Thank you very much, friends, for that really insightful, interlinked discussion. As Stefano said, I think a lot of us do not see the invisible gorilla, and it's really important then to pause and make sure that we're looking at it in the eye, and that's what we've done this afternoon. I'd like to come back to your point, Jason, on the development finance nexus, and particularly looking at the debt challenge right now. We heard from, I think it was Jane, who was saying that in Uganda, basically, there's about less than 3% of the budget going into industry, which 2.5% that is going to industrial policy, if I could put it in a very kind of broad way. And we've heard, for instance, that even on health and social protection, I mean, it's far, far, far outcosted by the debt servicing that we have. And then we have kind of different kinds of priorities that are leading macroeconomic direction. So how do we break that cycle is the question. How do we go forward as African civil society, as global civil society, to break that nexus and to move forward for a global financial architecture that would support some of the proposals that Tete and Janet have put on the table?
Ok. Merci. Je suis venu en retard parce que j'étais ailleurs, mais j'ai écouté une partie et ça rejoint un peu les débats sur le premier panel dans cette salle le matin. Et j'ai écouté Jason où il disait que à la TICAD, le Japon est en train de négocier pour que le marché et le riz soit importé en Afrique. Mais pendant ce temps, nous, Africains, nous avons la terre, nous avons le soleil, nous avons la pluie. Qu'est-ce qui nous manque pour produire le riz en quantité? Il manque la volonté politique. Et cette volonté politique va venir d'où? Viendra de nos dirigeants qui voient, de nos dirigeants qui ont une vision claire du développement. Lorsque nous avons des dirigeants qui sont choisis par même les Occidentaux, vous dites, bon, c'est celui-là que nous devons prendre et c'est lui qui fait notre volonté et non la volonté du peuple. Je pense que tout ce que nous sommes en train de faire là, nous serons en train de faire ça chaque fois. Je les suis. Chaque fois dans les sommets, Nations Unies, par-ci, ils portent la voix de la société civile. Mais face à ces dirigeants qui ont des oreilles bouchées, le travail est difficile. Le travail est difficile. Il faut que nos dirigeants comprennent. Je prends le cas de mon pays, le Bénin. Aujourd'hui, l'économie béninoise a un nouveau souffle parce que l'industrialisation a commencé et le gouvernement qui est là a trouvé une vision en mettant en place une zone industrielle. Et aujourd'hui, il y a plusieurs types de produits qui sont transformés au Bénin. Ça fait de la main-d'œuvre, ça fait de la plus-value pour l'économie. Combien de pays africains sont dans cette dynamique? Nos dirigeants ont, c'est-à-dire c'est le premier, hein, le premier levier sur lequel nous devons agir, le choix des dirigeants qui sont capables de faire cette transformation. Ok. Et c'est très bien qu'au cours de ces genres de conférences, que nous ayons les parlementaires. Nous avons écouté les parlementaires hier. Chacun d'eux fait en fonction et selon ses capacités ce qu'il peut. Mais lorsque également nous avons des parlementaires qui, par la politique du partisan, je suis partisan, c'est mon gars qui est au pouvoir, donc je dois soutenir, même si je ne dois même plus chercher à savoir si c'est avantageux là, c'est mon équipe qui est là, je vote. Et c'est après qu'on demande explication. Là aussi, il y a problème. Donc c'est un ensemble que nous devons mettre en place pour que vraiment la transformation que nous souhaitons, c'est-à-dire ce que nous voulons pour que notre économie, pour que nos pays n'empruntent plus, soit là. C'est au niveau des hommes. Et il faut vraiment travailler sur le capital humain. C'est très important. Merci.
Thank you. My question is based on a post here by Donald Trump, I think early in the week. It's a post on Truth Social, and he was saying, I will stand up to countries that attack our incredible American tech companies. Digital taxes, digital services legislation, digital market regulations are all designed to harm or discriminate against American technology. I'm asking this question as we have these conversations about democratizing this international Okay. Yeah, so the question was asking, even as we have the conversations about democratizing some of these institutions, particularly the WTO, when you have a powerful international figure like him saying, he essentially doesn't care what you guys are going to say. And we have not seen any country or any serious challenge against those tariffs and all these things that he's done since, I think, early this year. So even as African states are trying to, look for these opportunities on how to challenge all this, is it worth it? Or should we look for other mechanisms or other political ways to deal with it apart from going the direction of democratizing them or doing that?
Yeah, I don't think it's really a question, but mine goes to Jason. I want you to comment on the success of the new African credit rating agency. When you look at that topic, I think it's one of those things that will help Africa in terms of financial governance. But based on the fact that creditors still have the discretion to actually follow a credit rating agency they would wish to use to base on the rate at which they lend a nation. So what feasible solutions would be there for Africa that even when they produce their credit rating report, that it would actually be considered by the creditors? Then the other question is on when you look at mineral resource countries. So for instance, like us in Uganda, we expect to have our oil by next financial year. Yes, and when you look at the model government is going to use, they are looking at two options. There is a fiscal rule in the Charter for Fiscal Responsibility that some money will go to the credit, the treasury, for the national budget, but over 90% of the other resources are going to be used. They're going to be invested into a wealth fund, to have sort of a future generational Ugandans to tap into the resource. So my question goes, because when you look at some of the models and the asset classes they want to invest in, they list things like sovereign bonds, and when you look at the current advocacy, we've been saying that some of these financing options are not good. So won't it look like sort of a hypocrisy, like if you're going for such instruments as a developing country? Of course we want to develop, but what are those investment options that African nations can go for that don't infringe on other nations? Yeah.
Maybe the last couple of comments and then we...
Okay, all right. Thank you so much for your presentation. This is not my area of expertise. I'll just start by saying that. But I needed clarity on the monster or the gorilla which we released, first of all. Is it the is it how the politics is structured that we think people are fighting at the high level, but they're actually friends at the lower level? I needed that clarity. Then I wanted to say the other monster probably that we are not seeing is because you raised a lot of important things talking about how Africans are thinking about industrialization. It's the wrong way. We don't have a strategy. We are not regrouping like others. So for me, I feel the problem lies there. Why is it that we are not thinking about it in the right way, yet just here, four of you have that expertise, but why is it that our leadership is not thinking the way you are thinking? Why is it that they don't have this kind of thinking? Is it us also who are detached from them? I would like clarity on that. And why don't we have a strategy anyway? We're always complaining of how we've been marginalized. Why is it so hard for us to have a strategy? I always think of, okay, I work on conflict and security. I always think of terrorists. They're very organized, and that's why they're able to mobilize very fast. So if you use their analogy of cells, how they set up according to cells, small cells, maybe that could be a strategy. You put African groups which are thinking sort of in the same way already in cells. Don't target the entire continent, because of course people are not always friends. But why don't you start with those small steps? Just thinking out loud again. Yeah, no strategy, no set of principles. Again, I feel you have a lot of answers. You have it clear in your head what needs to be done. How do you help those leaders implement these things that you have in your mind? What's blocking you? Thank you.
Thanks. Over to you for the last one, and then I really wouldn't want to be in the shoes of the three of them. But I'll pick on the monster. Just
yeah, just wanted to maybe get a comment from the presenters, from the panelists, on the promise of the AFCFTA and in contributing to some of the reforms to global trade and some of the challenges that we are seeing right now that you've talked about. What I see also becoming an issue is that in as much as there is a promise and there is a potential to it being something that will improve interregional trade, which will improve economic development on the continent, it's also potentially an avenue or a conduit for a new colonization in terms of who is actually investing in interregional trade on the continent, and how are we ensuring that that investment is actually related to improving the position of Africa and African trade.
thank you so much. So I wouldn't want to be in your shoes. Let me let me pick on the question of the monster, because I'm the one who pulled in the gorilla, right? I think the gorilla we are not seeing is the following one. We spend so much time, particularly as civil society, but not only us, generally, in perfecting our aspirations in terms of, the normative frameworks we desire and how it needs to be based on all sorts of principles and everything else. And while we do that, the global division of labor is being reshaped. The global economy is transitioning to an entirely new phase. And while that happens, we keep on exchanging on how to perfect our aspirations on the world that was before, So I guess that's, for me, is the big gorilla, This is happening right now, and we are still trying to claim aspirations on a world that is no longer there, So that's basically, for me, is the big mismatch. Now, they thought I was not going to add my own questions, Poor them. They're nice in their thinking. So generally, I think the one comment I would add is that let's think about how much over-reliance on global decision-making there is. I think if we could audit how many days African ministers and heads of state spend abroad in negotiating and rediscussing or advancing global policy or global agreement versus the one that is invested in the region, I think it will be probably a cold shower, you know, in seeing how much over-reliance there is on external global somehow solutions. And you've heard me saying here and in previous AFCODs that the global is only a space for renegotiation. It's not a space for solutions. Now, I have 4 questions. First, the debt community is so vested into this sort of renegotiation or reframing or re-architecturing. But isn't there the solution to the debt crisis structural transformation? And if so, how is it the debt community doesn't engage much more prominently in the structural transformation question rather than in the external renegotiation one? You know, if the commitment is to tackle the debt crisis, and if that is the determinant, you know, I think that's one first important question. The second one is that, and I know this is not an easy one, because the question on how we transition from an export-led, commodity-driven model into what we've been discussed. And in the past, there has been a lot of discussion on the role of sub-regions, sub-regional entities, you know, as a way to create a wider domestic market without engaging to global value chains. But many of the African sub-regional economic processes are heavily disrupted and very often also trapped in conflicts. If I speak about, sorry if I call it our own region to our Kenyan friends, but in East Africa, you know, literally every East African country is currently a conflict, either with itself or with somebody else, you know? So the idea of thinking about the regional economic process is profoundly challenging. Yeah? So where are we with that? Then another question is, if we recognize that there is an unsustainable debt burden, how can we renegotiate debt on the basis of a structural transformation agenda? You know, rather than purely an creditor-based financial sort of renegotiation, you know? And what role public credit agency, which I think were mentioned, including an African one, can have in providing confidence to that structural transformation agenda. So these are all questions for me on how to bring the agenda for debt sustainability and transformation back to the region rather than in that sort of global decision-making space. And I'm so happy that I'm asking the questions. I don't have to give the answers. Who wants to start?
Okay, let's see how I can do. Let's start with Trump, because it will lead us to many places. First of all, I think Trump, we should call Trump for who he is, right? It's a braggart, not a very pleasant character, okay? A transactional president. But actually, what Trump is doing is giving voice, not simply to the MAGA crowd or anything. It's giving voice to the turbulence of the American economy that is in crisis, which is seeking to reorganize the global economy for itself. So that's what it's doing. It's basically taking the nearest tool that he can handle to cudgel the global economy into submission. So this is not a tariff problem. Look, the man who says that, okay, Bolsonaro is not being treated well, so I tariff you. You are buying oil from here, I tariff you. He has lost the plot about tariff. It's about how do I use the power of the American economy to be able to extract concessions from who? And the people who, so if we understand that, then there are two things. As I say, it is, and thank you for the monster, it is how we recognize what is happening and deal with it. First of all, different parts of the globe recognize what Trump is doing, and they ask themselves, what is my level of preparedness today to respond in what way? And if I'm not prepared enough today, how do I retreat and regroup? That's basically what is being asked. So, you see, let me take the European friends. Our European friends, when the European Union says, okay, we will import so much billions of oil from the US, the European civil society organization were up in arms. How dare you? You've caved in. You've done all that, right? And I was thinking, but European Union said, will buy oil from you. It's not the government who consume the oil. The private sector will consume the oil. The private sector will say, okay, they are not buying the oil. Or Japan. So, okay, we've opened up the car industry to American cars. But the cars for America are so big, the Japanese will not buy them simply because the tariff is increased. And yet, if you look at what civil society positions are now, from whether I OIMs or not, is to pummel our government and say, you are cowards, you are retreating, you are doing this, then we restate our demands. We are looking for global equity in international trade. Now, take our poor president, Ramaphosa. The car industry in South Africa is dependent on the American market. It contributes to at least 1,200,000 or 200,000 jobs. The citrus industry, right, contributes about under 500,000, depending on the American market. Transport tariff. Ramaphosa decides to go and negotiate. Then African countries say, why did he go there? You know, he's disgracing us. But he's on the threat of losing 600,000 jobs, right? If civil society wants to be part of the conversation, what we should say is that, do we recognize that our countries need a briefing space to regroup? And when we are regrouping, what are we offering as an alternative? Civil society, as he's saying, is hooked up on a demand for equity. You should stand up for our sovereignty. You should stand up for this, when at the moment, actually, is a time to say, we have a crazy mind in the world, we need to regroup and rethink. We are not part of the regrouping and the rethink, I promise you. If you look at the message throughout this whole conferences yesterday, it's about the moral high ground of what we deserve as Africans, rather than the reality of what we are negotiating from and how to build power and reorganize power. So the big lesson of Trump is to recognize where we are going to renegotiate. And the other countries of the world are doing that. Look, so I don't like war. And I'm unhappy about the European Union saying they're going to build their defense industry. I'm unhappy. But at the same time, if we know that the defense industry is also a catalyst for reorganizing industry, Germans say we are reappropriating 500 billion or 50 billion euros to invest in our economy. And to do that, we are going to cut away procurement from American companies. Whereas we are going to repower our economy. The negotiation should be whether or not war is bad, but whether what is doing this reorganization or reindustrialization can we contribute to. So the first thing is, are we still talking about principles in terms of the abstract, or are we thinking about the political economy of struggle, of rebuilding in the moment of war? And what do we do about that? That I think is our problem as civil society. And that takes back to two more questions. The sister who says we don't have a strategy. What are we doing about it? I don't want to talk about governments anymore, okay? Sometimes I blame myself. For the past 20 years, I'm one of the people who have been championing policy space. And I never asked myself, what policy is my government going to put into this policy space? Which of us have asked ourselves? Which of us have asked ourselves that since we want policy space for industrialization, what is the kind of industrial strategy that our government should pursue in that space? Part of the problem of our civil society, when we gather, we demand principles and rights and morality, but the challenge of building the economy is about saying what are we going to put into it. So again, I can say that there's a lot of problems, but and the final thing, because SCFTA. Now, the simple answer is this. We Africans, we love regional integration. we are the most, the country which likes unity the most, and it's important. But two things, in spite of the validity of having integrated economy, I want to put on the table now that the ACFTA is going about it the wrong way. The ACFTA believes that by opening markets, you are transforming Africa's economies. But it's not true. There's a difference between a transformation agenda driven by how you produce, which is different from our agenda driven by how you sell. And at the moment, the paradigm of the ACFTA is more about opening market rather than saying, how do we go sequentially to empower the productive elements to occupy that market? And the danger, therefore, is that, in fact, it's the bigger players in Africa, together with the bigger external players who will occupy the markets again in Africa that we are creating. And that, we can get into an argument, and I can argue with you for the whole next 3 years to just prove that. But we don't have time, so I'll stop here.
Yeah, I think we will have Jane and thanks Tete for that. I think we'll have Jane and Jason, and we wrap up the session because you also deserve a coffee and a break.
Okay,
Jane, over to
thank you so much for all those comments. One, I just want to add on to the issue Tete has raised about the unilateral measures, the tariffs. In Uganda, we have the European Union has imposed on coffee, the deforestation regulations on coffee, cocoa, palm oil, and all that. But I want to add on the issue of the reality, because, for example, in Uganda, 70% of our coffee goes to the European Union. So to say we fight, we say no, where are we going to get an alternative market? 70% of our coffee, So sometimes we need to look at the reality, then you start regrouping, looking at alternatives and, when you are still exporting. Basically, on the issue of investment, I think that's why we need an investment policy, which is very good, which we can be able to use to direct it to our strategic sectors. Most of our investment policies, and we have been working on this, around the entire continent, apart from countries like South Africa, it has no human rights impact assessments. It doesn't talk about technology transfer. It just says investor come in, we give you incentives, and you take out your money. So we need to look at the policies we have. The issue of Stefano, of structural transformation, I know this one on structural transformation and fiscal. It's for me. I think debt. We can look at structural transformation as an escape from debt, but at the moment we need that fiscal space. I will give you an example of my country. We use almost 40% of our internet generated resources to service our debt. So we need that fiscal space in the short term. In the long term, we need to structure and transform our economies so that we can generate enough resources to be able to pay off our debts and to be able to service to finance our development. On industrialization, industrialization is not new in Africa. That's why we talk about deindustrialization. So we have been industrialized, and we can go back and look at what did we do right and what did we do wrong. You can take an example of tomatoes here in Ghana. What happened to your tomato production and tomato industry? Because you opened up. Tomatoes came from Spain and all over, and the economy collapsed. Because any time you don't add value, then there's a problem. There's a problem. The agriculture downstream also collapses. I think I will stop there. No, lastly, allow me to say that we need to be real. We need to recognize the reality of our development. And that's why we need to go back to the basics to ensure that we can be able to feed ourselves. We can talk about rural transformation. We can talk about appropriate technology for our agriculture. Instead of looking at lofty issues, lithium, and I am glad you talked about clay. That's the reality. Instead of saying we need EVs, let us talk about appropriate technology. So we need to look at the reality of our development needs and development aspirations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefano, Comrade Tete, Comrade Jane, and to all of you for the very exciting questions. So let me just first of all align with the question you posed, actually, about the solution for the debt crisis being linked or finding its way to link with structure. I think in the very simplest way, the answer is yes. Right? But then we need to then unpack what that yes actually means, because structural transformation in the current architecture cannot work for the continent. I think Jane and Tete have spoken about that, and I think that's where your gorilla analogy comes in, is that we want to do things in a system that's broken. We want to fill a bucket where there's a persistent and constant hole in that bucket. We can't do that. And so by that definition, the solution to the debt crisis through structural transformation cannot be achieved, right? Because the system and the structures within that system cannot and will not facilitate that. So in this moment of disruption, in this moment where there are different types of monsters, we do need to maybe take a step back. Joel Odige from I2C Africa was saying, perhaps we need to bring back that mantra of we can't pay, we won't pay. Right? Perhaps it is something we need to think about and think about very pertinently in the context of what it is we want to do. But perhaps it's also a case of we can't pay, we won't pay. However, we need other things in place. And that is what came up in the previous discussion about HIPIC and the debt cancellation. Yes, we got the fiscal space, but immediately after, countries were borrowing. So it's structural. It's systemic. You cannot deal with the debt crisis without dealing with structural transformations with regards to trade, with regards to food, with regards to other dimensions. So it's intrinsic that these different dimensions must work together if we're going to take that kind of radical approach, and whether we do want to really disrupt, add ourselves into that equation of disruption that is currently going on on the continent. Now, on the point of the Africa Credit Rating Agency, it's not yet up and running, but it's getting close to being completed in terms of what it's going to look like. I've said this many times publicly. I think politically, it was a brilliant stroke of genius for the African Union to make that announcement. Because part of this conversation of sovereignty, emancipation, independence, breaking away from the norm starts with a political statement of that nature, because everybody shakes, shudders, and wonders what's going on in Africa that they've decided to make or create or establish their own African Credit Rating Agency. So I think from that point of view, it was fantastic. Now, what we need to be careful of is that there isn't capture by the so-called technical experts who are giving capacity building and technical assistance to the African Union to create that African Credit Rating Agency, and that they're not coming from Moody's, Standards & Poor's, and Fitch, right? That's what we need to guard against and ensure that, that's where it's going to make the difference. Like any rating agency or any index or barometer, the African Credit Rating Agency is going to need and to build its own legitimacy. And that comes with what Tete was saying. Do we have a strategy beyond just establishing the rating agency? Do we have the principle that African Union member states are going to defend that African Credit Rating Agency and say, we don't agree with Moody's or Standard & Fitch, we believe what the African Credit Rating Agency, and if you do not recalibrate your methodology to that, we're not borrowing from you. Yeah? And you need that boldness, because that is where you contribute. That is where the policy space that you get becomes something that we can add to this chaos. Your point on, and maybe this is also linked to what Jean, you mentioned around the debt situation, structural transformation, and issues of oil and the sovereign wealth fund. We've been there. Sovereign wealth funds was a big thing in the 80s, in the 90s. The issue is, in principle, a sovereign wealth fund is not, there's nothing wrong with it. It's the governance. A sovereign wealth fund can be governed to do several different things. It can have a budget line that goes to development projects. It can have a budget line that invests in international capital markets to multiply the fund itself, like any sort of savings fund. So I think the question is, do we have the correct governance system to ensure that the sovereign wealth fund can... We saw what happened in Angola. We saw what happened here in Ghana with their own sovereign wealth fund, across the road in Nigeria with their own oil wealth fund. So the issue is not whether a sovereign wealth fund is correct or not. The issue is, do we have the governance system to ensure that it can be run in the perfect way? And then on the escaping the debt crisis through infrastructure, through all these different types of investments, again, if you look at the physical infrastructure that has been invested in by Europeans, the Chinese, whoever you want to, a lot of it has been to predetermine an extraction system. The railway line that's been built in Kenya by the Chinese, is an extractive one. It's literally, it goes into the hinterland of Kenya to dump cheap Chinese goods, right? No, it is, but nobody talks about it. It runs from the port of Mombasa, and it runs into very rural parts of Kenya to dump. I mean, I've been to some parts of rural Kenya, and I ask myself, where did you get these things from? I shouldn't, but I'm amazed. But that's exactly what is happening. And the same thing in Uganda. The extractive nature or the crowding out of the ability of domestic industry to flourish as a result of these infrastructure investments that are financed through debt is something that very few leaders actually think about or actually consider in their cost-benefit analysis. So again, it goes back to this point of where finance and the real economy are just not talking to each other. Because we want to see the money come into the treasury. We're very happy, but then we're not actually seeing the productive capacity of this issue. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and a big round of applause for the three of them, but also for everyone here. Let me just conclude by saying that we wanted to raise more questions and answers. I think we definitely managed, but you will never look at the gorilla the same way.